All right, joining us again, and early subscribers to the channel will recognize John because it's been what, John, like 2 years?
Yeah, it's 2 years since you and I had our chat about the Gulf War and what happened to the tornadoes and everything else then.
Yeah, so we had you on for an episode that I called Tornado Down.
Mhm.
RF Aviator on his hellish days as a POW during Desert Storm. So if folks that are just seeing this have not seen that episode, recommend highly that you check it out. And now John has written a book called Eject. And what's important in the title is that subtitle, which is Escape from the Aircraft is just the beginning. So basically, John talks about every other ejection besides his own. And so half of the book is sort of the development and the mechanics of the ejection seat, and the other half, and this is a facile ratio, I apologize, John, but are, let's just call them C stories, folks that have ejected and the effect, the resonant effect it had both on them and their families. So John, let's start by talking about the early history of the ejection seat.
And most people think of Martin Baker, which is the seat that you and I sat on for so many years, as the kind of the pioneers, but they weren't the only makers of the ejection seat. So the first recorded real story of ejection, I think, is 1943 with a German in a Messerschmitt that had gone out of control, and he had a compressed air escape system. So the seat, it was basically like almost like a powerful spring, and indeed some of the first seats were jack-in-the-box springs. They simply got you up out of the lip of the aircraft that you were in so that you could fall out rather than trying to clamber out into the airfloor. And the compressed air one blasted the first guy out using compressed air, and he had to obviously then still release his parachute. In the Martin Baker aspect started with Sir James Martin, or he wasn't Sir James then, James Martin, and his flying partner Valentine Baker. And they'd set up their aircraft company again before the Second World War, and they started developing aircraft during the Second World War. James was the engineer, came over from Ireland, and Valentine Baker was the pilot who'd won awards from World War One. And James invented a number of aircraft, but his mate, his best pal, was killed in an aircraft in front of James. Crashed on takeoff, an experimental aircraft, a test aircraft. And Valentine Baker burned to death. And the account of it is actually quite brutal in actual fact. James never really recorded his thoughts, but it is generally supposed that seeing his best mate burn to death changed James from an aircraft designer to an escape system designer during World War II. And that's what he basically started out as. And it ended up in the aftermath of the Second World War with the first ejection seats. He was testing them. The first ones were basically a metal seat with an explosive charge on it. So you're basically sitting on a bomb, which you activated. And he was testing these using sandbags. And at some point, he decided he needed to test them on human beings. So a fitter from his aircraft said, "Okay, boss, I'll do this for you." And I've sent you a picture, and you've seen it in the book, of the guy's kind of, he's in his Sunday best suit as though he's going out for dinner after church with his family or something. And he tested them on the ground first, and then he went off and tested them airborne. And that's how the Mark I Martin Baker seat came about.
So the first guy to eject is this guy, Joe Lancaster. So let's talk about the circumstance that led to him.
So I knew Joe. He's a Second World War pilot. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross. We knew each other quite well. As you can see, we shared many drinks together over the years. Sadly, Joe passed away 3 years ago now. After the war, he became a test pilot, and he ejected from his experimental AW-52. If you look at it, it looks not unlike a B-2 Spirit. And this is back in 1949. Amazing looking aircraft. There's no computerized aided design. There's no simulators. If somebody built an aircraft, an experimental aircraft, the way you tested it was to get in and fly the darn thing. And that's what he was doing. And it went out of control. And he's sitting on a Mark I seat. So it goes out of control, and he has to decide, right, as you well know, ejection is your last chance of survival. It's dangerous, But if you do not eject, you're going to die. And so Joe ejects. He's not very far from his home. He can see his hometown of Coventry, where his wife and son live. So the aircraft basically goes out of control. It's porpoising. It's throwing him around everywhere. So the first thing he has to do is pull the handle to flip the canopy off. So the aircraft canopy is blown away. The next thing he has to do is then, it's a red handle. The very first seat had just a head box handle, and he pulls the handle down, pulls the handle out, face mask comes down, and he pulls that, and the ejection seat fires. And that is more or less the end of the ejection seat's role back then. It's got an explosive charge on it, and it blasts him like a champagne cork, which is what he describes it as, out of the aircraft. And so Joe is now at, I think, 5,000 feet, tumbling on this seat. A small stabilizing parachute comes out of the seat to help stabilize the seat, but the seat has finished its job. It's exploded, and he's out of the aircraft. Joe then has to reach up, tumbling like on a sycamore leaf, has to find his seat release harness. Joe's got to be really careful because he doesn't want to mix it up with his parachute release harness. So he has to click, twist, click, and then unstrap, physically unstrap from the seat. And I think it's got 6 straps on it, unstrap from the seat while he's tumbling through the air, push the seat away, and then he goes into free fall, reaches back around to find his parachute release D-ring, pulls his parachute ring, his parachute opens, and he's floating down. Joe's the first man to eject in anger on a Martin Baker seat, and the process took him just over 30 seconds.
That's a long time, as you
Can you imagine?
No, I cannot imagine. And when I was reading this, as you described, to sort of with your hands as you're hurtling through, 20,000 feet or so, try to figure out to release the seat and not the parachute. That just gave me the willies. Reading that. Obviously, this is a suboptimum escape system. As you've just described, the machinations you've got to go through. So as development went on, we went from different things to get you out of the airplane, from a spring to, minor explosions.
Well, my favorite one, and I only deal with it very briefly in the book, was what was basically called the hook system, which was like a fishing rod. And so basically there was a massive big pole down the spine of the aircraft, and it's anchored at the tail like this, and it's got a huge spring under it. And there's a hook which comes off it and goes down onto the pilot's harness. And if he has to eject, he has to get rid of the canopy and then basically release the spring. So like a fishing rod, it goes, or a Roman catapult. It flicks up and it basically hooks the guy out the cockpit and flings him across the back of the tail. I mean, can you imagine that?
So speaking of that, the book outlines a few, let's just call them wacky ideas. Again, in the development phase, all of these, which seem eccentric and Byzantine now, seemed reasonable at the time. But you have the Yankee extraction system. There's the Bell Aerosystems Regalo wing, which was kind of, it looked like something that Leonardo da Vinci would have designed. The Fairchild Stratos Corporation escape system, which is sort of a James Bond-esque kind of a looking thing. And then the Kaman Aerospace Corporation gyrocopter. These were all in play. These were ideas that were happening.
The Fairchild Stratos Corporation system, the seat basically came out of the aircraft. And as it came out, instead of the seat stabilizing parachute stabilizing the seat, it began to pull out what is in effect a mini microlight aircraft. So it pulled out a tail boom, and then springs came out and extended wings out of the side of the seat. There's a little motor under it. Basically, the pilot is then sitting in what is in effect a microlight, or in the Cayman, the Carmen one, in actual fact, literally a James Bond flying seat.
So like everything in R&D and in technology, particularly military technology, the innovation was a function of lives lost by and large, right? And so, or in some cases, permanent damage to neck and spine. So we got a little more elegant with how you got out of the airplane over the years, because people sustained grave injury by ejecting. Yes, their lives were, saved, but at pretty great physical cost. So what were some of the high points that got us to the modern ejection seat along the way?
James Martin had gone from the Mark II, which was still a manual seat. By the time he'd got to the Mark III, they were automatic. Instead of that seat just being a metal seat, it wasn't a computer because it was the 1950s, it was clockwork. It then sensed that you were safe from the aircraft, G meters measured what you were doing, and then it cut you free from the seat, and the seat was dragged away and the parachute was automatically open. So we went from manual to automatic. And then the next big development was the rocket seat. And so we went in the 1960s, James was looking at, us 50s, and then into the 60s, was looking at, instead of an explosion, rocket packs. You still have the initial small explosion, which starts to raise the seat up. But as the seat rises up, there's another cable which is attached to the floor of the aircraft, and it triggers the rocket pack, which is under the seat. And so you put the promo of the book, you put that up at the beginning there, Ward, and you can clearly see. So that's a Mark 10 seat in a Harrier. That is Martin Pert ejecting on the runway at Afghanistan. And as you can see, he's carrying live weapons, which is why he wants out of that aircraft. If you watch the video, the flames just about a third of a second before that, the aircraft is engulfed in flames and his cockpit is engulfed in flames. But you can clearly see there the ejection, and you can still see, if you look beneath the ejection seat, you can see bits of his canopy and everything flying away. But the rocket pack is fired, and that is now, instead of a kind of a 22G kick up your backside, all in one go, you get a kind of a high G kick as the explosion goes off, and then the rocket pack fires, and you're on that James Bond seat for about a second as it blasts you 300 feet, 250 feet into the air. So the Mark I, you had to have enough time to eject, unstrap, push the seat away, fall free. So you had to be at kind of 5,000 feet. The Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V, you could actually be on the runway at 60 knots and eject. You'd probably break your legs, but it gave you enough time and there was enough airflow to pull the parachute out. So runway 60 knots on the ground. And by the time you get to the rocket seat, the Mark 10 that I sat on, that's a 0-0 seat. So you can be stationary on the ground and eject, and you'll be, I'm going to use the word fine, but it will take you high enough to allow you to be released automatically from the seat and to float down. And so I described Joe's seat, which took 30 seconds. I was on a Mark 10, completely fully automatic rocket seat. So when I ejected, hit by a missile system, you pull the handle, and then the next thing you know, you're under the parachute. But the process that the development of the seat is astonishing. Because what happens now is you pull the handle, the tornado cockpit was blasted free on a rocket, little rockets that simply threw it up, and then it was blown clear behind you. Then the initial ejection charge fired, so the seat began to rise up, and as you rise up, you've got arm restraints and leg restraints now to hold you steady so that you could eject at 600 knots. And people have done that, and you still could be injured, but there's a chance of being safe. Your arms are dragged in as you come up the rails. Your legs are dragged in and held in the back of the seat. And as you rise up the rails, I think by about kind of a foot, then the rocket pack fires, and then the rocket pack takes you out the aircraft. You accelerate from, I think it's around 0 to 200 miles an hour upwards under around 15 times the force of gravity in about half a second. And as you come out of the aircraft, the seat is now sensing what you are doing and where you are. The seat is stabilized by its own little stabilization parachute. It senses if you're stable and beneath 10,000 feet, it will cut you away immediately. And so basically it starts to, all the little things go click, 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 whir, whir, whir. You're not aware of any of this. It cuts you free from the seat, releases you from the seat. The seat has got the parachute which actually pulls the seat away from you as it cuts you free. So it is just pulled away from you. And as it pulls away, its last action is to release your parachute. And so you then float down. Joe was on a Mark 1 seat, 30 seconds. I was on a Mark 10 seat, fully automatic, just over 2 seconds. And it is so quick, so instantaneous. All I remember is a really hard pull of the handle. And I mean really hard. You don't want to be trying to do this a second time. I can remember almost a fizz and a kind of looking down and seeing flames coming out my backside. And then the next thing is parachute opens and you're under a parachute. And you're now a normal parachute. Although in my case, I was a normal parachute parachuting down behind enemy lines. And then you get through now to the Mark 18 seat, which is in the F-35. And that now is a fully computerized seat.
And you're talking about it also has autonomy where sometimes it decides, when to eject.
It has autonomy only in the circumstances of when you're in the hover. If one of the fans fails, the pilot will not have enough time to eject before they hit the ground, because the downward vector, and this was part of the big development of the rocket seat with a Harrier, because you could have a downward vector countering your upward vector, and that was the huge problem, which people have been really badly injured by that. So the downward vector on the F-35 would mean that you didn't have time to eject, and so the seat, if the fan fails, the seat will eject the pilot with no further reference.
The other thing that comes to mind, John, when you're talking about the automatic ejection system and the circumstances, the flight regime where it might happen in the F-35, is that mishap where the factory pilot ejected or was ejected on the runway at Fort Worth a couple of months ago. And I have not seen the closed out mishap report, so I don't know what the final answer is. But some were surmising that the guy did not pull the handle, but that the logic had ejected him because he met the various parts of the.
I'm surprised he or she, well, we know who it is, didn't go earlier in actual fact.
Well, that's the thing, because when you look at the sequence, it's like, okay, now he's under control, and then he ejects, right? Or he is ejected after he's coming to rest in the runway or in the infield. Like you said, when he was rolling out of control, it's like that's when I would have pulled the handle. So again, the point you're making here is the technology has come really, really a long way since those early days.
The point that I make endlessly is these things sit in that aircraft for years. So you think of your Tomcat on a carrier, getting rained on, getting sea salt on it, people clambering in and out month after month after month on deployment, and they sit there and they do nothing and they wait and they just sit. And they're such amazing pieces of technology that 10, 15, 20, 30 years after they were built, 5 years after they might have been put in an aircraft, some unlucky aviator goes, oh my God, and pulls the handle. And they work.
And oh, by the way, shout out to the AMEs, which was the rate in the Navy that worked on the seats during the periodic maintenance. So they would pull the seats and make sure that the rocket motors hadn't timed out.
So we call them armorers. They're our armorers. And so for armorers, they're the ones that look after us. And so my armorers they always present you with a handle after you eject. Clearly mine didn't come back with me because it's still in the desert somewhere. But the agreement is that you take them a case of beer, which is actually small recompense for saving your life, isn't it? So case of beer, and you get, they presented me with this, with handle mounted and everything else. And everybody who ejects, or did at that time, the armorers would give that as a thank you for the case of beer that we gave them for saving our lives. But they're absolutely, without them, my God.
Well, that's one of the coolest things on an I Love Me wall, as I said last episode, that you can have. Obviously, to earn it, you've got to do something fairly harrowing, to put it mildly. The other thing you get for ejecting is your Martin Baker ejectee number what? Everybody who's ejected has a number. What's your number?
Well, there's two different things. So there's the Martin Baker Club, because you get a little tie. I should have brought my tie. You get a little tie. You get a tie with the red triangle on it, and you get a little certificate and a little pin that you can wear, a tie pin and everything else. So the club is basically when you join the club. So I am 4,417, but in actual fact, that doesn't matter, because back in the 40s and the 50s, people just never bothered. And so there are thousands of people who never bothered. And interestingly, sometimes now people will pop up from the 1950s and say, I ejected in 1953, and they will have a higher number than me. What I have got from the Martin Baker records is when my number in the sequence. So Joe Lancaster is number 1. In the sequence of ejections that are recorded, I am 6,089.
Wow. Okay, so there's like 2,000 guys who didn't join the club.
Easily. And if you look now, I think it's up to 7,657.
So if you're 4,417, is John Peters your pilot 4,418? Because he came out right after you.
I think I'm before him, because in command eject, MCO, I think that you call it, if whoever command ejects the rear seater, the Wizzo, the nav, goes first. I think about 100th of a second before. So your number is the first one, and then the pilot. I think that's how it happens.
So that's a fantastic segue into the MCO discussion. I use the acronym MCO, which is Mission Commander's Option in the F-14. So if the handle was forward in the back seat and the Rio had control of where this handle went, it was on the left console. So forward it said pilot. And what that meant is if the person in the back seat pulls the handle, canopy will come off. It's a single piece canopy, unlike the Tornado. So single piece canopy. So the canopy would come off and the Rio would go, or whoever was sitting in the back seat would go only, and the pilot would stay in. If it was in the rear position, Mission Commander Option, MCO, then canopy would come off, backseater would go, half a second later, front seater would go. Okay, so I'll just remind folks who may have seen this episode, there was a circumstance out at Fallon, Nevada, where the air wing was out there. This was VF-213 flying an F-14D, and you could see the pilot has no upper handle because that's a Mark 14 ejection seat, Martin Baker Mark 14. But they had this one ship driver who was a captain. He was actually the air warfare commander in the battle group, and he had been begging for a FAM ride, and he had his seat quals. He'd done swim fizz, and so they're like, okay, it'd probably be smart for the air warfare commander to experience flight in the F-14. And so during the demo, the pilot, who was a lieutenant, was like, I'm going to show you some zero G, right? And so the captain had not, the ship driver captain had not strapped himself in very well. And so he reached for the handle to pull himself back into the seat, and boom, pulled the handle. Fortunately, the handle was forward. The MCO pilot handle was forward, so only he went. Now, like we're saying, it's sort of a theme here. Sort of the refrain here is this technology was a function of people losing their lives. So you have a story in the book of an F-4 before this technology existed.
The story in the book is about an F-4, which did not have command eject. And so basically the guy, the pilot had some sort of seizure, and his guy in the back, the nav, the Rio, was trying to get him to keep control of the aircraft. In the end, he knew that he wasn't, and he was in formation with another F-4, and the guys were saying, get out, you've got to eject. And he wouldn't do it because he didn't want to leave his pilot, and he left it until the very last minute and ejected. Pilot remained in and was killed, obviously, impacting the sea. Command eject came in on the Tornado. Interestingly, in the first years of the Tornado, some of the pilots, because a lot of the pilots who went onto the two-seat Tornado had been single-seat Jaguar Harrier pilots, and they were not happy with giving a navigator control. I think there is 2 or 3 occasions in the early 1980s where something did go wrong with the aircraft, and the navigator ejected, but the pilot stayed in and was killed. And so we went from people being killed in two-seat aircraft because there's no command eject, people being killed in command eject aircraft because they didn't want to trust the guy in the back, or the woman in the back as it would be now, with a command eject. By the time I got to the front line in the late 1980s, every single pilot wanted to fly with command eject enabled, because they said, listen, I don't care. I want the best chance of getting home to my wife and kids. It was all men. However, the other story in the book around that is when things go wrong, when things go tits up. And there's a story in there where the command eject system, the guys are flying in Germany, and A-10 comes in to do a mock attack, which is what happened all the time in Germany. We would have 1,000 aircraft in the sky in an afternoon. A-10 comes in, and the guy in the front doesn't see him until the last second, and it basically looks like a head-on collision, and he basically hauls back on the stick, lights the afterburners, and pulls and rolls as hard as he can. The Tornado was your original electric jet. Instead of cables, it was digital, fly-by-wire. There'd been a couple of occasions when the Tornado had been flying by a very powerful radio mast, and it had gone out of control because of the strength of the radio signals. It was thought had sent the Tornado out of control. The guy in the back is heading looking at the display. He thinks that the jet has gone out of control because he knows there's a mast. He simply reaches down and pulls the handle because he thinks the jet's out of control. Biggles in the front is completely in control and he's just avoided a mid-air collision. The next thing he knows is he's under his parachute and all of his papers and his maps are floating down. He thinks he's had a mid-air collision, but he's been command ejected from a perfectly serviceable aircraft.
Well, like you said, sometimes things go wrong. I think, as you also said, by the time we got several decades into command eject, fleet pilots were like, hey, you're a professional backseater. I trust you. In fact, on one of my recent episodes, Tom Page was talking about flying into the barricade on the USS Ranger because they ran him out of gas. And he does expressly say to the Rio, you've got the call on ejecting. I'm just going to fly the airplane. So if we flame out, I'm going to keep trying to either relight the motors or whatever, but you've got the ejection sequence. You own that thing. I've also shown a plat tape, a carrier videotape several times in a couple of different episodes of an F-14 behind Cat 3 that gets blown over the side. And you can see here the airplane noses over the side and gets hung up in the catwalk, and the Rio ejects them. Now, I heard anecdotally after the fact that the pilot was not happy that the Rio chose to eject. He said, I knew we were going to stop. You just, strike damage to a perfectly good Tomcat. Let's segue into a couple of these individual stories. The first one that comes to mind is Bill Schaffner, and he was doing an exchange tour and wound up having a mishap in the Lightning. Talk to us about his circumstance.
Yeah, Bill had a Vietnam combat pilot, a really experienced guy in the late 1960s. He'd done a tour or two tours in Vietnam and got the Lightning exchange. So the English electric Lightning, an amazing aircraft. If you put it into burner, the fuel would last about probably 3 minutes or something like that. But he was on exchange tour with the Lightning, inexperienced in operating the Lightning, and he was doing a night intercept over a horrible night over the North Sea, and basically got too slow. What they think happened is impacted the water, and so he went missing. And the story then went on for another 25 or 30 years. Because, as is tradition, obviously all the nutters got involved that was 1969, I think. They found the aircraft, I think it was about 7 or 8 months later. I can't remember the exact dates. But they found the aircraft kind of about a couple of 100 feet down in the North Sea. There was no Bill Schaffner in the cockpit, but the cockpit canopy was closed. The seat handle had been pulled, but the seat had not fired. It was still in the aircraft. Schaffner was not in the aircraft, and you can see on the picture that his PSP, his personal survival pack, so you're attached to that. The strap for that has been unfastened and is hanging over the side of the aircraft, trapped under the closed canopy. Where had Bill Schaffner gone? The UFO extremists said he'd been captured by UFOs, aliens, and he'd been taken. Then this went on for years, and I mean years. But what had actually happened was hit the sea, probably badly injured, hitting the sea in a Lightning at maybe 140, 150 mile an hour. He had tried to eject, so he pulled the handle. The seat hadn't fired. Now, not because of a problem with the seat, but in a Lightning, the canopy has to go first. There's no canopy breakers or anything on the Lightning ejection seat. When the canopy had been serviced, the firing unit had been tightened too much, and a screw stopped the canopy from firing. A simple tightened screw. And they found that in actual fact, a number of the lightning canopies were like this. So if anybody had ejected or tried to eject, they would have been killed because it wasn't coming off. The seat didn't fire because the canopy didn't come off. The theory then is that Bill, badly injured, stinking night in the North Sea, rain, freezing cold, probably opened the canopy, unstrapped himself. He unstrapped his personal survival pack, which had his dinghy in it, because it would be quite difficult to get that out of the seat to jump over the side. He probably jumped over the side, badly injured, maybe couldn't inflate his life jacket, but certainly perished in the North Sea. And he was never found. His body was never found. Why was the canopy shut? That's what the UFOs enthusiasts got on. As the lightning then sank, because it would have sank pretty quickly, the water pressure would have been increasing on the cockpit canopy, and the hydraulic pressure over time would have melded away. And so the canopy simply, as the hydraulic pressure went away, the canopy shut. And that's how the lightning was found.
But like you said, that family didn't discover that for decades.
Oh, they didn't discover that first.
Because this happened pretty early in his tour.
Yeah,
right?
well, he was still, he wasn't quite, he hadn't been declared fully combat ready. So he'd only had maybe 16 or 17 hours on the lightning.
So here's this American family living in England and sort of they were loving it. You know, they were really getting into it. And then suddenly dad appears to have been killed in a mishap, although there's no closure. They move back to Wisconsin or something. And she gets married to a school teacher, right? And the boys are raised by that guy. And then a long time later, is it the son that comes into this information?
After the initial kind of letter saying we're still looking into it, the American liaison officer was posted back to America, and everybody forgot about it. So when the accident report, and back then in 1970, accident reports were considered secret, so they weren't kind of handed around. Accident summaries were, but accident reports were not. Nobody told the family what had happened. So the last they heard, I think, was about 2 months after the accident, saying, we found the aircraft. Bill is not in it. He is missing and absolutely certainly dead. And that's the last they heard of it. The liaison officer said, I'll come back to you once we know a bit more. Nobody ever did. So that's 1969, 1970 now, I think it was. So for 30 years, Bill Schaffner was never really mentioned. It was a different time back then. His sons knew about him, and they kind of had a few bits of his old equipment, and they had a box with some of his old flying kit in it, but they never really spoke about it. They just knew that their father was missing, not presumed dead, missing dead. In, I think it was 2000, so the early days of the internet, one of his sons is kind of sitting in his office I think he's in Chicago by now, in a law firm, and he's doing, I don't know, was it called Googling in 2023?
Trying to find out what his dad...
It could have been Yahooing or something back then.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was. And he kind of Googles Bill Schaffner lightning, and the first stuff that comes up is reports saying taken by a UFO. And there's all this stuff, that a transcript of a conversation with Bill Schaffner saying, I can see a bright light in the sky. Oh my God, it's coming for me. Oh my God. And that's the first his son, who was, I think, 1 at the time, so his son's now kind of 30 or something like that, the first that he knows. His father's been captured by aliens. So his son saw this. And kind of at the back of my mind, aliens, but he then spoke to some of his late father's friends, aviators, and said, this is absolute nonsense. That transcript is made up. We don't speak like that. That none of that happened. But it spurred him on, and he eventually came to the UK, forced the Ministry of Defence, who were still, even back then in 2000, reticent for some unknown reason about releasing details, but he got the accident report, which showed what had happened.
In terms of the ejection seat piece, the lesson there is ejection seat maintenance, right, is why the seat didn't fire. But again, as we said at the outset, this book is about the stories beyond the actual ejection, and that one is compelling and full of sorrow, and it's decades in the making. The next one I want to review real quick is because I thought this had only happened in the United States. In fact, I did an episode about this, which was a VF-74 F-14 pilot in an exercise scenario shot down a U.S. Air Force F-4. And that's the Smoke Dorsey episode. Again, if you haven't seen that episode, check it out. But a similar thing. In fact, this was a national scandal, right? I mean, this is like, all of the sensational papers in the UK were all over this thing. So this is an RAF Phantom shot down a Jaguar. So talk to us about how that happened and what were the after effects of that having happened.
This was in the middle of the Falklands War, in actual fact. So the Falklands is going on in 1982, whatever it was, 8,000 miles in the South Atlantic, the fighting there. People are ejecting, people are dying, ships are going down. And in Germany, we've still got aircraft on quick reaction alert. I think, the Soviet threat is still very real. Aircraft are routinely armed, exercises go on. And so at Wildenrath, which is in northern Germany, an exercise goes off, and all of the first thing that happens is all the Phantoms are armed to show that we can do it. And then they're de-armed, and then some of them are launched on exercise scenarios. They send one airborne armed. This has happened, and it does happen, but there's a number of things. The interlocks have to be fitted, although it was found out afterwards that there are no interlocks. You can't go with pins in the you can't fly with the pins in. So the circuit breakers are meant to be not made. The trigger shouldn't be made live. The electric circuit should be open. The controller should know that he's controlling an armed aircraft and make calls that say, check arm, check switches safe. But as you know, in an F4, to get the camera to roll, if you're doing a practice intercept, you make the switches live, some of the switches live. And you go through the sequence as though you're doing it for real. So Phantom gets airborne. At the same time, a Jaguar has been on doing just a trip right up to the northeastern Germany, up near Hanover, I think. And Steve Griggs is heading his way back to Bruggen, which is only probably 10 miles from Wildenrath. He's heading his way back. And I don't know if you ever flew in Germany. It was a pain in the backside. There were so many units around trying to weave your way around. And he's weaving his way, what's called the clutch, it was called, to get back to Bruggen. And he's probably about 3 or 4 minutes from landing. And he's flying with Paddy Murphy in another aircraft who's his wingman. So they're kind of flying through this, weaving their way, thinking about having a cup of tea and a sandwich with their lunch. They're close to landing, and Steve says he could see that on his RWR and his warning receiver, he could see there was an F4 tracking him. This happened all the time in Germany, absolutely normal. But sometimes you would react and go into a practice kind of counter, but not when you're on the final kind of 3 or 4 minutes to landing. So he just let him do it. He said, and I saw on my radar, I couldn't see him. I watched him track all the way around and then come into my 6 o'clock. And so Paddy is in the other aircraft watching this. And so the guys in the Phantom went through all the sequences, forgot that they had live Sidewinder missiles on. They forgot. Shit happens. And they went through, and he went, Fox 2, the Jaguar, yada, yada. And to his horror, a Sidewinder came off the wing of the aircraft. Whoosh! I don't know, you've seen a Sidewinder going off. It is one hell of a blast. And it simply went straight up to the through the Jaguar. Now, the saving grace here was the old Sidewinder, I think the Golf. So it wasn't a blast fragmentation, it was expanding rod. And so for the viewers, an expanding rod, the newer ones are blast fragmentation. So they're a grenade with little titanium rods that simply tear through an aircraft and a person, blasting it apart. The expanding rod was a welded rod crammed around the warhead. And basically what happened was when it went off, it expanded into a circle of metal, like a circular saw that you'd use in a workshop. And Griggsy was lucky. The first thing that he knew was that Paddy Murphy was shouting, eject, eject at him. And he didn't quite know what happened. He said, my aircraft wasn't working. I was kind of stirring the controls, and it wasn't working because his cockpit had been cut away from the aircraft. So the jet had gone behind him. That he was flying a cockpit not attached, like in a cartoon when all the cables are coming out the back. So he's not attached to anything. And he said he was looking, it just tilted down like that. I said, what the hell? Paddy watched this happen. He said all I could see was a flash, and the back of Steve's aircraft went away, and his cockpit tilted and started rotating. And so Steve said the cockpit rotated, and as it rotated, as he came upright again, Paddy was shouting, eject, eject, and he screamed it. And Steve said, well, Paddy must know what he's talking about. So he just pulled the handle. And he was lucky that it was an expanding rod because the seat wasn't damaged and he wasn't damaged. And he ejected from the aircraft. And he was lucky that it was an expanding rod because the seat wasn't damaged and he wasn't damaged. And he ejected from the aircraft. Helicopter comes up, picks him up and takes him off to base. Well, takes him first back to base, to the medical centre on base, where all of his mates are waiting with beer. He's then driven to the hospital 6 sheets to the wind for his x-rays. That would never happen now. And at the end of that, he's driven back to his base, and the phantom crew that shot him down had been invited for a beer to the base. And so he was having a beer with the blokes who, 5 hours earlier, had shot him down. It was a catastrophic sequence of mistakes. So, put simply, they'd forgotten that they were armed. This does happen. How many people have accidents with loaded guns? It's difficult to imagine, but it does happen. So that was the first thing. They'd forgotten. They made the switches when they shouldn't. One of the biggest things that had happened was you had circuit breakers in the Phantom that you'll remember. The guy in the back pulled the circuit breaker, but he was carrying in his pocket, on his G suit, in his lower pocket down by his calves, he was carrying airfield information, a big book, and his pistol, because it was an exercise, and he wasn't using a holster. So he had that in the pocket. And what had happened was his bulky lower G suit pocket had closed the circuit breaker again. All of this sequence of events came back in the long. We had a thing in the Air Force called break the chain. If you can break the chain of events, you can prevent an accident. That chain was long, and nobody broke the chain, and it ended up with losing an aircraft and Steve Griggs very nearly being killed. And he was very, very lucky. And the two guys were court-martialed and found guilty of gross negligence. It was a bit unfair because it was their fault. They forgot they were armed. But there was a lot of organizational, corporate, Air Force things that had gone on that meant it was an accident waiting to happen.
Well, there are a lot of similarities to the VF-74 mishap that I was talking about, but there's some substantial differences too, which is the F-14 pilot fired with intent. In fact, he station stepped, as I described in the episode. He went Fox 2, as Rio wasn't really paying attention. He went Fox 2. It was the Station 1 Sidewinder, and it didn't come off. So he actually station stepped to Station 8 to have the missile come off. So he intended to fire a weapon. In this case, they didn't intend to fire the missile. The only reason he pulled the trigger was so that the HUD camera, the gun camera, would spool up and record the fact that he had the shot. The other thing that, in fact, the British press made quite a big deal about this part was there was supposed to be red tape over the master arm switch that said basically, okay, don't turn master arm on. And that tape wasn't there. And so they're like, okay, so we lost a multi-million-dollar airplane because we were missing a couple of, pence piece of red tape. You've got to be kidding me. The last sea story, and again, I entreat folks to read the book. It's called Eject by our good friend, John Nichol. In Kosovo, an F-117 was shot down. So when I heard this had happened, I'm like, hold it. Didn't we buy these things because they're invisible to radar? So how did this F-117 get shot down?
Yeah, so Dale Zelko, F-117 pilot, Lieutenant Colonel, I think he was, experienced pilot, flown in the first Gulf War. I think he was on the second raid over Baghdad. And you're right, the F-117, everybody said was the aircraft you couldn't see on radar. Well, not strictly true. The reality is that in certain circumstances, you can see an F-117. You can, especially because you've still got to open those great big bloody doors to get the bombs out. And so he's over Serbia, and he's got a feeling that things are going to go wrong. He said we hadn't really learned the lessons from the Gulf War. We were becoming a little bit more complacent. We were flying the same kind of routing. There's a guy in the ground, a missile commander, a Serbian missile commander, Zoltan Dani, I think his name was. He had made some adjustments to his SAM 3 system. SAM 3, mate, is a, what is that, 1950s? You know, this is kind of a huge big supersonic bus that's fired. It's old fashioned, but being old fashioned was kind of good because he could mess around with various frequencies. Depending on the frequency of the search and the guidance radar, there was a chance that you could actually pick up an F-117 with its doors open, and lots of other things determined it. They know, because they've got spies on the ground, that the F-117s have taken off from Italy. They know that they're going to be there, and they can take a pretty damn good guess at where they're going to come from. They can ready their systems to look in that direction. And sure enough, Dale, as a singleton, is over Belgrade or on the outskirts of Belgrade, drops his bomb, and as he cleans up, he sees two flames coming up through the thin cloud layer. And he says, they've got me. I know that they've got me. He tries to maneuver. The first one misses him. The second one explodes and simply just blasts his aircraft apart. He's tumbling. It blows off. I think it's his right-hand wing. And if you go to the Belgrade Museum of Aviation, his wing's in there. So his aircraft is basically flipping over and over, completely out of control. So he is ridden up in the seat, pinned up against the cockpit, and he's looking down on his seat. He's trying to reach the handle and he can't get to it. It's not a center handle on the F-17. It's got the two side handles. It's an ace's seat. And he tries to brace himself. All he can remember is saying, this is going to hurt, because he's up against the cockpit. He's not on the seat. He can't remember pulling the handle, but he clearly does, because the next thing that he knows, he's at, I think it's on like 12 or 11,000 feet, and he's under the parachute. He manages to get a call out to an AWACS on his survival radio. It's a Brit on the AWACS, and they managed to get a rough position. He lands. He's not that far from Belgrade, and you can see Belgrade burning, and the B-2s are going in now, and he can feel the blast from the B-2s wash over him when he's in his little ditch. A massive rescue mission is mounted. He's in contact with an A-10, and they say, right, the helicopters are coming in. Use your survival beacon, the infrared survival beacon. So he clambers out of his ditch into a bush, sets it up. It doesn't work. It's not working. So he can't send out that signal. And in the end, they say, right, sod it, go live. And he pops a flare. The rescue helicopters can see his flare go off. He immediately douses it. And the next thing he knows, there's a whoop, 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 whoop. And he can see the sparkles of light. Lands. He stands up out of his ditch. Three very big guys approach. One of them's got his picture like that, and he's gone through all of the challenges and things that you would do. And the guy still is looking like that. He said, what does he say? Your PJs are here to take you home, sir. Many years later, the guy who shot him down makes contact, and he goes back to Serbia to meet the guy who shot him down. And they become friends. Just a heartwarming story.
Again, the book is Eject. Escape from the Aircraft is just the beginning. The author is our good friend, John Nichol. John, a triumph. I highly recommend this book. It gets the coveted Mooch 2 thumbs ups. So you've done it, and we've talked about some of the stories here, but if you're watching this and now you think, oh, now I know what the book is about, you do not. So this has got to be on your must read list. So John, thank you for spending some time with us once again. Look forward to having you on the channel again very soon.
Cheers, Mitch. Absolute pleasure again. Great to chat to an aviator about aviation. Thanks, mate.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/wardcarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.